Carlisle is probably a place that many may never have heard of. It doesn't strike you as high on the railway marker list in history, but it does have a history, and the Railway Museum is proud to showcase this in a very special way. Carlisle has always been an important gateway between the north and the south, and had a large Roman military stronghold. Its fort along Hadrian's Wall is considered to be the largest and held 1,000-strong cavalry. After the Romans absconded, the people remained, and it became a contestable hotspot between the English and the Scots. With the city and its newly built castle changing hands several times, the locals got so sick of it that they turned to raiding loot from whichever side was weakest at the time. With the ascension of a Scottish king on an English throne, uniting the borders, only then did the fighting cease. There were still a few raiders hanging about, but they were swiftly dealt with and within 60 years had been eradicated. But the town, while beaten and battered, remained. It tried to keep up its military presence. However, industrialisation was rearing its head, and soon soldiers gave way for workers. But as with all industrial hubs, transport of materials in and out is key. Carlisle started production in food, textiles, and was started engineering works, so needed a network. At first, it used canals, but this was quickly replaced with the railway and had at one point the largest railway marshalling yard in the country. This is where Port Carlisle came into play. It was the best place to link the city to the Solway Firth, and with it the sea and the countries beyond. In the early days of the Revolution, the largest import was coal, which could be sent up and down the main river. In 1720, a levy was due on any movements in the river from coastal areas. The locals fought against this and the levy was waived, and an act was drawn allowing people to build housing and even wharfs. But other than dredging, they were not allowed to improve on the river in any other way. By 1807, it was clear that the river was unsuitable to meet the demands, and a public meeting took place to decide the best course of action. The only action was building a canal, but it took a lot of ideas and over 10 years of deciding, but a route was finally cut. It would start at Port Carlisle, and then it would go to both Newcastle near Pontine and to the slate quarries near Ullswater. It was going to be wider and deeper to accommodate seafaring vessels and carry 75 locks. By 1823, it was dug and ready for traffic. But it didn't take long for attitudes to change. People were getting fond of railways, and canals were beginning to falter. Less than a year later, Newcastle was considering linking to Carlisle, but needed to decide on rail or canal. The railways won, and initially the canal saw a boom in profits and work. But the boom ended, and as more railways cropped up, the canal was seeing the railways as competition rather than an ally. In 1844, the Lancaster and Carlisle Railway was formed, as well as the Maryport and Carlisle line. Both were slaps in the face to the canal for both profits, and passenger numbers started to suffer. Conceding defeat, the canal took its last passengers in 1853. But it was not all over for the company. Instead, the canal was drained, and the canal bed was converted into a track bed. It was a pretty simple conversion, and the line followed the now dried canal. Passenger facilities were erected and sidings were produced. The line saw goods traffic in its first year, but were ready for passengers a year later. The company, now remade into the Port Carlisle Dock and Railway Company, started to run steam engines as soon as it could. But in a weird twist, the railway decided to step back to the more traditional roots of horsepower. The North British Railway built a series of passenger dandy cars for the line. No one really knows why dandy cars are called dandy cars, but it's suspected that the name came from old wagon carts used in mining and cars used for the carriage of horses. The horses would ride in the wagons on descent and then be released and attached to the wagons to take them uphill. The idea of moving horses in this way was credited to none other than George Stephenson himself. By the mid-19th century, the vast majority of horse-drawn cars were now known as dandy cars. The Port Carlisle cars were not too dissimilar from the stagecoaches of old. Instead, passengers would sit on the outside depending on their class. Baggage would be placed on the roof, and there was a seat for the driver. Freight didn't last long on the line, but the dandy car outlived it by 15 years. People loved travelling to and from the port in the cars. It's not known why the locals decided to revert back to horsepower, but it can only be surmised that the locals were not fan of the louder, clankier engines. In 1914, the line finally had to concede defeat, and the line became steam-powered once again. The dandy cars were removed and were placed as pavilions for the town's sporting facilities. In 1925, although it was not original, to mark the Stockton and Darlington centenary, organisers of the event in Darlington approached the dandy car's owners with a view to showcasing one at their exhibition. The owners agreed, and one car was selected and repainted in its original colours. The car took centre stage at the exhibition, and when it was done, the car, now looking too good to be back as a sporting pavilion, was taken to Edinburgh Waverley Station, where it was put on display. Thanks to this sudden turn in luck, the dandy car was now considered preserved. But the dandy car could not remain at Edinburgh, so the National Railway Museum was approached. The museum gladly took the car and is now a unique and different part of the national collection. But what of the line? Well, the line was passed over to the LNER during the grouping from the North British Railway, but the LNER saw little promise in the line, and in 1932 the decision was made to close the line for good. It was said that the locals gathered on the village bowling green to lament their line's demise. Interestingly, the infrastructure actually survived for many decades after the closure. The station was actually still standing in the 1980s. However, the tides of time have taken its toll, and the only viable infrastructure that is visible today is the coving on the station platform, which now forms part of a car park. But the trackbed is still visible, nearly 90 years after it closed. The line may be gone, but the village thrives, and many original features from the town remain, such as the bowling green, giving nods from the Roman remains to the very heart of industrialisation. It's a wonderful little gem on the edge of the UK, and it's one to tick off that bucket list.